10 a.m. So with that, I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome everyone to 2024's, oops, a year ahead, sorry. It's the work pressure. Welcome to 2023's first meeting of the Citizen Commission for the Performance Measurement of Tax Preferences. And just as a reminder, the meeting will be viewable on the JLARC website or TVW. Staff have also provided an on-site location in the Helen Summers building to view this meeting. And we are also accepting written testimony, and we'll have more to say about that at the end of the meeting. But first, I would like to ask the JLARC staff to conduct a roll call vote of the citizen commissioners for the record, please. Perhaps there's a technical glitch there, so I will go ahead and conduct the roll call vote. Please answer here if you are.
Sorry, Ron. Grant, do you want me to do this?
Since I've started, I'll go ahead and do this, Marilyn, and then for all the other ones, I'm going to let you run that roll call.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I'll start with the voting commissioners first. Andy Meadows.
Here.
Ron Buing.
Here.
We just got it. Sharon Kyoko.
Here.
And that's my Bring the Bear.
Jim Orr.
Here.
And myself, Grant Forsythe, here, the chair. And we also have two non-voting members, Representative Jerry Paulette.
Present. Thank you.
State Auditor Pat McCarthy. Okay. Not here, so for the record, we do have all the commissioners are present, so we do have a quorum for today, and we do have quite a bit of voting business to take care of. And so with that, let's go right on to the commission business, and in particular, Eric Thomas, the legislative auditor, will introduce JLARC's new audit coordinator, Stephanie Hoffman.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, Eric Thomas, JLARC staff. I am pleased to introduce you to Stephanie Hoffman, who has been a longtime JLARC analyst and most recently, the past couple of years, has been editing the tax preference reviews and is responsible for a lot of the streamlining of the reports that you've seen in the past couple of years. She's a great analyst, a great leader. I think you will really enjoy working with her.
Great. Stephanie, any comments before you join the rough and tumble world of tax preferences?
No, thank you. I really am looking forward to the opportunity, looking forward to getting to know all of you. And I already know we have a great staff, so they've been teaching me a lot over the past few months. Thank you.
Great. Thanks and welcome aboard.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll move on to the first action item of the day. This is the approval of the October 18th, 2022 meeting minutes. Do we have any, does fellow commissioners or anybody like to comment on those meetings before we approve them? Okay, not seeing any. Do I have a motion to approve the October 18th, 2022 minutes?
Move to approve. This is Andy Knopfsiger Meadows.
Do I have a second?
Second, Ron Buing.
Okay, so seconded. Then I would ask Chair, actually in this case, I'm going to ask staff to do the roll call vote. And so Marilyn, I'll turn that over to you.
Thank you. This is a vote to approve the October 18th, 2023 Citizen Commission meeting minutes. Dr. Grant Forsythe.
Yay.
Andy Meadows.
Yay.
Dr. Sharon Kyoko.
Yay.
Ron Buing.
Yay.
And Jim Orr.
Yay.
Unanimous approval.
Thank you very much. So moving on to the next item, it's going to be our annual review of complying with public meetings and public records. And so with that, I will turn it over to our AG Assistant Attorney General, Kristen Lamson, who will give us a bit of a review on the complex nature of records retention and other issues in the state of Washington.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me back. And I'll just start off. I think last year was the same. You had your first meeting of the season right around the same time as Public Service Recognition Week. So I like to say thank you for your service. It's a great segue into what we are going to talk about briefly this morning. One of the very foundations of public service is conducting government openly and transparently. Washington State has very strong, open, and transparent government laws. And that's the Public Records Act. I'll refer to that as PRA, and the Open Public Meetings Act, OPMA. Both of these laws came into existence in the early 70s, so they've been around for quite a long time. There are purpose statements in each of those laws. They're very similar, but the basic message is that the people of the state of Washington are not yielding their sovereignty, that they want to remain informed, and they want to be able to give you their information so that you're doing your jobs with the information from the people of the state. Some big picture things to understand about both of these laws. They are called remedial statutes. And what that means is that if there's a challenge or the way that we look at them, everything is presumed open or liberally construed, which means we're going to look for the answer to be open and transparent. There are exceptions in both laws. In the Public Records Act, that's exemptions where you can redact or withhold documents. We'll talk about that briefly in a couple minutes. And in Open Public Meetings Act, there's something called executive sessions. There are exceptions in both, but they're very limited exceptions, and they are the opposite of liberally construed, and they're narrowly construed, which means you really need to look at the language in the statute to understand the parameters of those exceptions, and they're very tightly worded. Getting creative and stretching limits is not the place for the limited exceptions that are here. Both laws also have training requirements. They require, when you first take office, to undergo training in both of the laws. And there's an ongoing training requirement that the cadence is only every 4 years. So you guys are ahead of the game in doing an annual review just to remind yourselves. I think that is a great practice that you have as a commission. It's a good risk management tool, and it's also a good demonstration of your respect for open government. So I think it's a great practice that I'm glad you're keeping it up. The other thing that we want to make sure, I've been doing public law for 25 years, and I still look up these statutes regularly. I do not hold all the weeds in my head. That is not the expectation for you. The expectation is that you need to comply with the laws, and you need to have a basic understanding of the big picture and know when to pick up the phone to ask questions or use the resources that are available. There's a lot of resources that are available. You can see in the agenda, there's a bunch of handouts. Those are updated handouts from 2021. There is a partnership between the State Auditor's Office and MRSC, the Municipal Research Services Center, which basically serves local governments, but the law is the same for local and state governments. So those tip sheets are really handy to keep in a file somewhere in your commission materials or on your desk. And if you ever have questions, it's an easy place to start. There's some basic, they're very approachable documents and help you zone in on what you need to zone in on. Other things that are available, if you ever need training or other resources, the Attorney General website has training materials and other resources available. There's an open government manual, there's an open government training, there's a bunch of videos. Those are all on the AGO website that you can all reach. MRSC has other resources. The governor's office also has training and board and commission resources available on its board and commission portion of the governor's website. Just to be aware, tip sheets and resources are not always up to date, so they're good resources, but if you're ever concerned or have a question, the statute and the case law is what we look at. And if you're ever concerned about it, you can pick up the phone and call staff and they can get in touch with me if needed. So our job for today is to do a really high level, just so that you have enough information in your back pocket that when you're doing commission work, you know when to flip the switch and say, oh, I need to be thinking about this as an OPMA issue or a public records issue. And then be able to look to your resources or pick up the phone and ask questions. So I'm going to start with Public Records Act. And I will say, if you have any questions, please feel free to jump in or raise your hand. I may not notice your hand raised because I'm looking back and forth to my notes, but please raise your hand or I'll open questions up at the end too. So Public Records Act, the big picture to be aware of is that it's pretty broad. A record is something that's prepared, owned, used, or retained by the commission. So that's a lot of things. It can be written, it can be electronic, it can be metadata, which is the data about your electronic records. All of those things are considered public records. Even if you're using your personal devices, your own computer or your own phone, if you're doing commission business and writing something down or taking pictures or recording something, those are all actually public records and the state owns them, not you, even though it's on your on your personal device. Public Records Act, I think one thing that sometimes people miss is that there's a companion statute called the Record Retention Statute, which is RCW 40.14. And that's essentially a law that says when you have a public record, keep it for this long and then you can dispose of it. The commission follows the general public records schedule that is on the Secretary of State website. And you also have one specific record retention policy, 1601, which specifically deals with your commissioner meeting materials. And that policy basically says you keep them until the end of your season. And once you've adopted your recommendations for a particular year, those meeting materials are no longer needed. So your notes, your agendas, things you've marked up, those things are no longer needed for commission business once you've adopted your recommendations and they can be destroyed. Any record you have, because it's a public record and it's basically a record of the state, you need to keep it according to that record retention schedule. And the only exception to that is if a public records request comes in or you have a litigation hold, if there were a challenge against your commission, you cannot delete or dispose of a record if a active public records request is in play, or if there's a litigation case where you're under a litigation hold. So it's just to be aware that you can get rid of stuff, but you got to follow the schedule to do that. And if you have questions about that, the biggest thing is that there is a category of transitory records. Those are things that are not necessarily something you need to keep long-term and can be deleted rather quickly. It's usually things that are around scheduling or logistics or things that you're not using for significant decision-making or policy development or your recommendation development. So it's good to have a handle on the types of records that you're using for the commission and have a sense of which things might be retained and for how long. The general process when a public records request comes in, and it is something that may come to a commissioner, anything that looks like, smells like, or seems like a public records request should be treated as one. There are a lot of timing and process requirements when a request comes in. So if you're not sure or it's even close, your job is to let the JLARC staff know as soon as you can that a request has come in and you think that it's probably a public records request, and they can do their job to make sure that that request is processed appropriately. The basic process is that there's some kind of notice that the request has come in. JLARC staff is responsible for putting out a 5-day letter. That timing is important. There's a lot of cases around the 5-day letter of whether it was put out on time or not. That 5-day letter can be the response with the documents if you have them and it's a small request and you don't need to spend a lot of time reviewing. That 5-day letter can also say we are getting the records, we're going to review them, and here is our estimated date of giving you the documents. So that 5-day letter is pretty important. A lot of agencies use some kind of template, helps you just march through all the steps you need to do to respond in that 5 days. The big thing that a lot of cases happen around is the requirement is that an agency and commissioners, if you have records in your office or on your computer or phone, is that you need to do a reasonably adequate search. As commissioners, this might mean going through folders on your laptop or other things on your phone. Some basic good practices here. I'm not sure if you guys, if you all have commission emails. You do. So it's really good practice to make sure you use those for commission business. If you receive an email or a text to a personal number or whatever, it's a good practice to forward those messages to your commission email and tell the sender that that's where they should go in the future. And then you can delete that thing from your personal device and have it on your commission account. That's where staff is going to look first in their reasonable, adequate search. There is likely certain types of requests where staff may ask you to do a search on your own devices. And it's good to think through how you organize your records on your own devices and how you might be able to respond to that. Generally, the good practice is that you give everything over to staff and they are the ones that make the decision about whether it's exempt from disclosure or needs redaction. The other thing to think about on adequate search is to document. So if you get a message from JLUC staff that asks you to look through your laptop, notice the date, respond promptly. JLUC staff may also be documenting, but you may need to sign an affidavit at some point down the road if there is a case or a challenge. And it's easier to just know what you've done as you're doing it. Keep a bullet list somewhere, send the email saying, here's where I looked when you send the records in to staff, and get into the practice of thinking about that. Public Records Act cases are very fact specific. And sometimes it's really hard you may have done all the right things, but you can't document after the fact when a challenge comes in. So it's good to get into the good practices of when you get a message saying, please search, respond to that email and include the date you did it, where you looked. There's no other, make some kind of statement. I don't think there's anywhere else that I need to look in my personal devices, and go from there. Once the documents are found, JLUC staff usually does a review, and that is basically a review for those limited exemptions. Sometimes they do check in with our office if there's some questions around the scope of an exemption and whether it's appropriate to use or not. Some of them are pretty easy and straightforward, but some of them have some nuance and can get a little bit thorny. The basic rule is that there needs to be a very specific exemption, and the document or the records need to fit exactly what that exemption says, and you can only redact the stuff that fits within there. Oftentimes, the reason you do the 5-day letter with estimated date is that there is a lot of time to go through big requests to review, and you're redacting words or sentences or paragraphs out of large documents that the rest of it is not exempt, and you need to give the rest of the document. So once it's redacted, then it gets produced. You can do installments. There's a lot of different procedural things that I think is more on staff's plate than commissioners. I think the biggest role for you as commissioners is if you receive a public records request yourself, to get it to JLUC staff as soon as you can, and be aware of your responsibilities around adequate search and documenting what you're doing for your records. We already talked a little bit about the exemptions. There's not a lot that this commission does that. There's a lot of exemptions that are very specific for certain agencies, but there are some that would probably apply to you. Attorney-client privilege. There's certain personal information that can be exempt. There's certain information around tax records, which is more likely something that's going to be in your lane. But if you ever have questions around stuff that you're feeling like it's, I don't know if I want this to be open, and you're not sure there's an exemption, that's when you pick up the phone and I can help walk through those kinds of questions. something to be aware of, Public Records Act and OPMA, we'll get to that one in a minute, does have penalties, and they can be pretty steep. The judge has discretion to do a penalty of up to $100 per day per record, and that's sometimes page. If you get a five-page request, may not be big, but there are a lot of people who send in requests for 10 years of documents, everything you have in your files, and you can do some winnowing down to get some clarification with that requester, but there are large requests, and the longer it takes to get it out there, the penalties can rack up. The other thing is that there can be attorneys' costs and fees that are also awarded, and those can certainly add up. One of the things to be aware of is that when a judge is looking at penalties, they are looking at mitigating and minimizing factors, mitigating and aggravating. And doing training is one of the mitigating factors. So you're adding some things in the good column already by paying attention and doing this on an annual basis. But the more you're trying good faith, where you're doing the good faith efforts of documenting and trying to keep your records organized and paying attention to the record retention schedule, those things are important for the judge to understand. And again, they're very factual. So thinking through how you're going to do it is a helpful thing, so that you're not having to scramble if a request comes in, because it can happen pretty quickly. Things to watch out for, we've talked about a little bit. Again, the personal devices and accounts, you have commission emails, so I recommend that you use those as much as possible. Be careful with texts and social media. Those can become public records if you're doing commission business or making comments around that. To the extent possible, use your separate email account and be disciplined about putting communications for commission business in the right place. Be sure to follow retention schedules to help manage, including on your personal devices. Understand which things can be deleted and when. And because you don't have an IT staff maybe behind you, that's something that you're going to have to do on your own devices. Using file folders and things like that are really helpful. And keeping things organized from the get-go is a helpful way to make sure that happens. Again, if you keep everything and you're not disposing according to the record retention schedule, if a request comes in, you can't delete it at that point. So if you've kept everything for your whole term and a request comes in, all those documents are going to be something that needs to be produced unless there's an exemption. And the biggest piece of advice, besides pick up the phone and ask questions and use your resources, is think before you create a record. Make sure you understand, is this a transitory record? Do I need to put it in writing? Is this something that I need my colleague commissioners to understand, and putting it in writing? If you're using it for making decisions or coming up with your recommendations, it's going to be a public record that likely needs to be retained. I'm going to stop there for a minute on public records and see if anybody has any specific interest or questions around any of those areas. Just give you a moment to ask any questions.
Actually, I have a question, and it's probably more of a comment about the email side. I believe we've discussed in the past the dangers of reply all.
Yes, I'm going to talk about that with OPMA.
Okay, then I will withhold that. Okay.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yep.
Any other questions on public records?
Yeah, this is Ron Viewing. I was so when we have the 365 that essentially they set us up with Microsoft 365 on this, and so when we do, like, I will do my documents and everything right on there. I don't save anything to my computer, so there's nothing for me to worry about then if it's being done in that format. There's nothing that I have to pay attention to.
I think you still need to pay attention, and I think if a request comes in, you may get some request or instruction from staff, but if you're using a commission computer and their systems, then that's should be taking care of a lot of things. And I don't know how your system works. So I would, before I say you don't need to worry about anything, I would say you still need to pay attention, but you're doing the right thing by using the commission systems because you have backup with staff. that are helping take care of the record management.
I just have a comment rather than a question. I think one thing I appreciate is the staff have been very diligent in terms of sending us emails through the email accounts that they've been set up for us. And I think just going back to Ron Boon's comment, I think it's the folders that they've set up for us that you can actually save documents. But I don't think we actually, at least beyond the last document we create, we don't create any documents per se. So for me, the question is if somebody has a request for information, really it's what the staff have provided us more than anything else. Correct?
Yeah, and that's usually the case. And so normally the original copies of those things are the public records, and in the general retention schedules, you'll note that copies of things do not need to be retained. So if you're know that a particular record is something that the staff is taking care of the retention part and keeping it on the staff servers or whatever, and it's just information to all of the commissioners, those are likely things, because they're copies, you can delete them. And I will let any of the JLARC staff jump in with any system stuff, or you can talk about it offline. But I do also want to just quickly comment that documents can be the emails and the back and forth. So just to be aware that the term document is broadly defined, or the records are broadly defined. All right.
And just real quick, as I recall, a couple of years ago, we did have a public information request on the cannabis preference that we reviewed. And so I did have to submit copies of, emails, which staff would have had access to, but also my written notes. I also submitted copies of those just in case. So it's rare, I think, but it has happened.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to jump in OPMA, Open Public Meetings Act. So this is the sister statute for meetings. All meetings are open and public, and meetings is liberally construed. It can be that from the very beginning of your recommendations, the first part of your deliberations, learning about a subject, if it's going to be something that you're going to continue talking about and then make an action on at the end, a final action, all of that part is considered action that needs to be in an open public meeting. There are a few exceptions to open public meetings, but none of them apply to the commission. There are things like proceedings under the Administrative Procedure Act, collective bargaining, or licensing decisions, but none of that applies here. So essentially any meeting for commission work needs to be open and public. There are three types of meetings under OPMA: regular meetings, special meetings, and emergency meetings. We are in a regular meeting right now. You have a schedule for your regular meetings. That schedule is filed with the code revisor. It's something that's available for anybody to look up. Each type of meeting has their own unique procedural rules and requirements. Some of them overlap and are the same, but there's a few nuances. I'm not going to get into the weeds of all of that today. Most of your meetings are regular meetings. You have the ability to call a special meeting at any point in time. You can do that either through the chair or through a majority of commissioners voting to hold a special meeting. The one thing to know about special meetings is that you can only act on items on the agenda, so you can't add things in the day of. And emergency meetings are just that. There is some waiver of some of the procedural requirements during an emergency meeting, like trying to post things within a certain amount of time and all of that. But it's good to be aware. You have an experienced staff that knows these rules, but it's good to think through, and I think this is more for staff, to have your procedures for each type of those meetings ready to go, so you're not scrambling to look up the requirements for an emergency meeting. a lot of agencies and commissions are looking at adopting policies for how they would handle emergency meetings. If you recall, last year I reported out that there was a legislative change in 2022, House Bill 1329, that created some clarifications and updates to OPMA to recognize that, especially post-COVID, that we have technological advances that allow for hybrid meetings and remote participation. And those updates actually provided some clarification around emergency meetings, allowing you to meet remotely. And it's good to just think about how you would do that, how you would communicate with each other if you needed to meet under emergency circumstances, and what your procedures would be. Or it's something that staff can be thinking about and just having it ready to go if there were ever an emergency. The basic procedural requirements are around notice and agendas. There are also requirements around minutes. Minutes are required to be taken, but there's no form. You don't have to do it in a particular way. The only content requirement also in the recent legislation is that if you have an executive session, you need to include the purpose of that executive session in your minutes. Easy best practice tip there is to use the statutory purpose for the executive session. There's a list of reasons that you're allowed to go into executive session, and that's the easiest way to put the purpose on the agenda. Brief and simple. If you want to add a little bit of brief explanation, for instance, if you're hiring a new person, you can say we're going into executive session under the statutory thing for the position of executive director or whatever. So you can give a little more information. There are procedural requirements around executive sessions. Also, besides putting the purpose, you need to make an announcement at the beginning of the executive session. You have to announce who's going in. Commissioners obviously are invited to executive sessions. You can have staff that are relevant and needed for the issue that you're talking about, and also your attorney, which might be me or somebody else, depending on the issue. No voting is allowed, no straw voting, no whatever inside the executive sessions. You can discuss the purpose that's allowed, and then you come back out and do any voting or action taking once you're out of executive session and back in the open public meeting. Under your bylaws, your quorum requirements are 3 out of 5. As long as you have 3 commissioners here, you can hold the meeting and conduct business. For voting, your bylaws are unique, and they say motion approved by consensus unless there's an objection. Majority vote is in your bylaws. I think you do majority vote for most of your meetings, which works. I think that's fine. I think the executive sessions, just want to point out that those are also narrowly construed, and we need to look at the language of the statute to make sure the purpose that you're doing. There a lot of questions come up around personnel issues, HR issues. There are a couple of exemptions, but they're about performance reviews, but there are times where some performance reviews have to be done in open. So there is some tricky stuff around looking at that. Again, these are the types of things to pick up the phone, and we can walk through them pretty quickly most of the time. Public comment, you do have a rule in your bylaws that you require public comment. So you're ahead of the game, because one of the changes in the recent legislation was that public comment is now required in regular meetings. So every meeting that is a regular meeting should have public comment if you're taking action. If you're not taking action, you don't need to have public comment, but if you have any actions on your agenda in a regular meeting, you're required to have a public comment agenda item. You do not need to have public comment at a special meeting. You certainly can do it if you want to, and even at an emergency meeting. One of the clarifications in the recent legislation is that one way that you can meet the public comment requirement is either oral or written testimony or written comments in advance. So the commission has adopted a practice to allow for written comments, and there's information, I believe, on your website so that people can provide written comment. The only rules around that is that the comments need to be distributed to all the commission members. The idea being that you're understanding that somebody did submit some comments for consideration. For OPMA, there are also penalties. In OPMA, if there is a meeting that is held in violation or you do an action in violation without a meeting, this actions could become null and void. There is personal liability under OPMA, which means that comes out of your pocket rather than the agency. First violation is $500 penalty, second violation, and any after that is $1,000. There can also be attorney's fees and costs, and there have been cases where OPMA violations have been the subject of recall petitions for certain commissioners or officers of the state. Happens more likely at local municipal level, but there has been recall petitions based on OPMA violations. The big things to watch out for, and Grant already gave a little preview. Meetings do not always mean you're sitting in a room together or on a Zoom together. They can be something called serial meetings. And this is the reply all practice tip. If the commissioners are all bantering back and forth or discussing an issue on email, that is considered a meeting under the OPMA. You can also do that by text or telephone. So you need to be careful about having discussions about commission business. If it hits a quorum, even if you're just talking to one commissioner and that commissioner goes and talks to a third commissioner about the same issue, that could be considered a meeting and you haven't posted it and followed the rules to make it open. So those would be potential violations under OPMA. Biggest thing is, again, use staff. You can do emails that go one way. And I think that's staff's practice to give out information in advance of meetings. They give you materials to review. That is fine. It's going to all of you. You're all on the same email. And this is where the reply all, please don't. That's where, if you have a question, you can reply to staff and ask your question, but really should refrain from replying all. It's also good practice to put a warning in the subject line or at the beginning of the email to just remind people, this is information only, please do not reply all. I think the other place where sometimes people have questions is social events, workshops, trainings, going to other commission meetings, and all of you want to go, or a quorum of you want to attend. That's totally fine to do. If you're going to something else and there's a quorum and you're going to talk about business, you should notice it as a special meeting. If you're just going to be there to watch somebody else or participate socially, as long as you don't talk about business, you're fine. I think the issue here is to be disciplined enough to not talk about agency or commission business when you're socializing or at another agency or commission's business meeting. So this one, I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions or if you want to get into any of the detail on any of the procedural requirements.
Questions from commissioners? Okay. Not seeing any. Kristen, does that finish your presentation on this particular section?
Yes, I think I just remind everyone that I'm always available. I think the first thing is to call staff and they may already have an answer. And if they don't, they can pick up the phone and we can work through an issue. And then just know that you have resources available. All those websites and the tip sheets that you got with the agenda are helpful starting places to help guide you and answer questions. But I think that's it.
Okay. So I have had to talk to, over the years on this committee, our AG representative. They've always been super responsive. So I do encourage commissioners to reach out if they have any questions about anything. Because again, the rules are fairly complicated and the AG's office are there to make sure that we don't violate those rules. So we do have an action item that actually also deals with Kristen Lamson's work. And so would be a commission policies update. I know that both Kristen and staff spent a lot of time on this, so I'm going to go ahead and let Kristen describe kind of the background so we understand what the issues are.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner Forsythe. So I'll also invite JLARC staff if they want to jump in and share anything. But essentially, the commission is also subject to another good governance law called the Ethics in Public Service Act, which is RCW 4252. And this came up, we took a look, the commission has a current policy. There was a constituent question that came in last year that was about something else, but it raised the issue. And we looked at the policy while we were reviewing that constituent question and realized that there wasn't a lot of clarity about certain things. So we did a little bit of digging and looking at some of the rules and some of the guidance information that's available, and have come up with this policy. So I'm going to talk about it just very briefly and then open it up for questions. So the first question we had, which was interesting, is that there are two different ethics boards at the state. There's a legislative ethics board and an executive ethics board. This commission is mixed. We have legislative positions and we have executive positions. And we had a conversation around who has jurisdiction over this commission. And it was decided that the executive ethics board is the one that has jurisdiction over the non-legislative commission members, but legislative members would still be under the legislative ethics board. So this policy is essentially for the citizen commission members. And the Executive Ethics Board is the one that is responsible for monitoring and enforcing the Ethics in Public Service Act. They are fairly conservative, and this is also a remedial statute. So very similar to what we just talked about, remedial statutes are liberally construed, which they're always going to be in favor of protecting the interests that they're there to protect. And in this case, it's another good governance. There's a legislative reason for this law in the statute itself, and it's basically, this is what the state of Washington, people who live here, want to have trust in their government, and this is a big piece of that. Besides the open and transparent laws, the ethics in public service law is another leg on the stool. We spent some time with Kate Reynolds, who is the executive director of the Executive Ethics Board. And there is actually a set of model policies that the board had adopted in 1996. So we used those model policies and worked through them. We had a couple of conversations with Kate Reynolds. And essentially what we're putting in front of you today is a policy based on the model policies that the Executive Ethics Board has already approved. Kate has reviewed these and thinks they're good to go. And our proposal is that this policy be adopted or considered by the commission today. And if it's approved, it would go to the Executive Ethics Board. And if they approve it, their next meeting is in July. This would be a policy that the commission would follow, and if the Executive Ethics Board also approves it, there is actually a safe harbor protection in the rules under the WACS, or the Washington Administrative Code for the board, that basically if you follow this policy and there is a finding at the board that there was a conflict of interest or a violation of the act, if you followed the policy, there's a safe harbor protection. So I think Grant and staff decided that it was good to at least put this in front of the commission for consideration. And you'll see that the model policies had two different areas that we had to work through. The policy 2301, I'm not going to spend too much time on because it's quite rare that this commission actually deals with any of the issues that may come up under 2301. That's essentially a policy around if you were ever doing any kind of approvals for grants, contracts, the more commonly understood financial type transactions where there's an interest that a commissioner may have in a particular transaction in front of the commission. I'm not going to go through that one. I think the policy is fairly straightforward and self-explanatory, and I think it's pretty low probability that it's going to come, these types of issues are going to come in front of the commission just based on the scope of your authority in your statute. Policy 2302, however, is the one to take a closer look at. This is the general conflict of interest statute, and I think sometimes people are confused that there is definitely a very clear and more straightforward and understandable conflict of interest around financial transactions and financial interests. But this law has a general conflict of interest provision, and that one is pretty broad. I think in our discussions with Kate, she was quite clear that there is a very broad understanding at the board. They do look at general conflicts pretty regularly. And so this policy is really intended to cover the general conflicts, which is more likely to come up for the commissioners on this commission. Just a couple of quick notes. The ethics and public service laws are an individual responsibility of the commissioners. It's not something that the agency is responsible for complying with. It's each one of you as an individual. There are also resources available for ethics rules. Kate Reynolds is available to do a training at any point in time for the commission if that's of any interest. She would go over the rules and how the executive board looks at them. And it's pretty broad. It would go over gifts. It would go over other things. This policy is very specific to the general conflict of interest and doesn't get into some of the other rules, but they are there and they are something that as an individual commissioner, you are subject to. So this policy basically is about beneficial interests in transactions of the commission. Those words are all defined in the statute. We really worked hard at looking at those definitions and how they might apply to this commission. And generally, we put some examples in there to help guide the conversation if you ever come up with a situation where a tax preference is going to be reviewed by this commission, to think about your own sphere of influence and activity. If you have a direct or more direct interest, and those things are showing up in the first couple of examples, if you work for a company that's going to get the benefit of a tax preference or something like that, that one's a little bit more clear. And the basic rule is that you need to disclose that interest and probably recuse yourself from voting on that particular tax preference. For other things that are a little bit more tenuous, and some of the examples at the end are a little bit more nuanced for you. You guys are all on this commission because you have interest and expertise in the exact areas that you're looking at as a commission. The Executive Ethics Board recognizes that, and they still want you to take a look at conflict of interest issues. If there's more tenuous interest, we try to give some examples of what that might look like in the policy itself. But I think at this point, I want to just perhaps open it up for questions. I know this came out to you in advance to review. And I think I'd like to just throw it out for questions, or Grant or staff, if you have anything you want to add and put in there, please pipe in.
Commissioner Buing has his hands up.
Yeah, so my situation, tax consultant, right? So years, that's what I do. I help people with taxes. Now, in terms of like going in and supporting a preference, in terms of going and making arguments, before the legislature or something like that, representing someone in that capacity, that's not generally something I've ever done for profit. Now, I've been a part of the WSCPA, the Bar Association, and the Association of Washington Business. And in connection with those unpaid positions, I have advocated for certain changes in the law at times. But so there's that side of it. If how that would be implicated if indeed there is a somehow a benefit or something that is there that I need to worry about. And the other part of it is, if you're, as a tax consultant, I am not necessarily receiving a benefit of an exemption. I am usually explaining to someone how it works, what the requirements are, and determining whether or not they might qualify for that exemption. And that person would be a client, obviously, and they would be paying me money to do that. Those are the two situations that I'm, as reading through the rules, I was kind of like, well, I don't know, it seemed like to be on the edge in both of those. Not necessarily was I getting compensated directly as a result of the exemption, but wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, everything is going to be a case-by-case basis. This is another very factual situation where you need to look at the specific facts. The first thing I'll say is that anytime you have a situation that you're particularly concerned about or curious about, Kate Reynolds is available for conversation. Excuse me. And she is a great resource and can walk through those kinds of scenarios with you and really help you understand which pieces. A couple of things. Financial interest is not the only thing to be concerned about. There are volunteer or political or other kinds of positions that could fit within the definition of beneficial interest. I think the thing that Kate can help walk through is how close or direct that interest is with what you're doing on the commission. And we did have a lot of conversations with her about the scope of what the commission is doing, and your role in the actions that you take are essentially approving comments and recommendations about the JLARC reports. And then the JLARC reports go to the legislature, who makes a final decision about the tax preference. So we spent a lot of time trying to help educate her on that. And I think there's going to be some, as situations arise, working through in practice how those types of scenarios work. I think if you're educating, then that doesn't ring as many flags or bells in my mind. But again, we'd have to walk through the factual situation. And it's more likely that Kate is the appropriate person to do that than me. My role is to advise the agency, and there may be agency issues that we need to look at when a commissioner has questions, if they need to recuse themselves, or is there a way to structure the voting or the action in a way to include them. That you'll notice in the rules that there are some caveats that say you can still talk about things as general education with the commission. So there may be some strategy around that I can participate in with JLARC staff to advise how that may play out as the commission takes their actions. But the general question of whether a particular relationship or interest, either business or volunteer-wise, is something that I would recommend picking up the phone and talking through that with Kate. So I don't have a great answer for you right now based on hypotheticals, but it is something that I think if you have any live issue, and at the beginning of each year you have the proposed tax preferences, it's a good practice to get into just thinking, do I have anything that I need to think through here, and do I need to start any conversations? So that would be my advice on that one. Sorry, I don't have any more black and white answers for you.
No, that's great. Would it be possible, I don't know if we've done this already, but to just simply have Kate's contact information sent out to our commission emails?
Yes, I will send that to Eric's and staff, and I'll have them send that out.
Thank you.
Yes.
I will just. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just seeing if there's any more questions.
Just a comment. I have actually spoken with Kate on the phone, and she is incredibly helpful. She's incredibly knowledgeable. And, so for example, in my case, I talked to her to explain my situation. I work for a public service company. We touch everybody. And so my guess is I'm going to have to talk to Kate periodically to sort of get a sense of the degree to which I need to simply disclose, or do I need to disclose and recuse? And I think it's just going to be a kind of a learning by doing process when we reach out to Kate as needed, or Kristen, depending on the situation, and then just, act accordingly. I think, though, this policy change is necessary. I think we do need to do it. I think it puts us much better in alignment with the state's intent on the ethics side. Even though it's going to maybe be a little bit cumbersome at first, I think it's the right thing to do. So anyway, I would just throw that out there. I have, again, I've spoken with her, and she's incredibly helpful and knowledgeable about this process. Anything else from commissioners?
Right. I'll just add one last thought that, that this process is here for a reason, and there's no bad thing about recusing or disclosing or whatever. It's really just making sure that the commission is doing the work in a way that is free from the perception of influence. And a lot of times that's what you're protecting against is optics and perception, not that you actually have doing something that's in conflict. But so I just want to say that, this is something that should be comfortable to pick up the phone and talk to Kate, because it's just an attempt to do the right thing for the commission work. So.
And I think also just for commissioners, it just means that we have to be a bit more mindful looking forward in time, which preferences we're going to be going over. So we have time to reach out and discuss, here's my situation. Is this preference going to be a problem? Do I need to recuse? So, staff, do you have any comments?
Nothing to add. I think Kristen covered it quite well.
Okay. So let me just say that both Kristen and staff worked really hard on this, trying to understand the process. Oh, and I just saw a hand up. Commissioner Kyoko, did you have a question?
I didn't have a question. I just have a quick comment. I think I had, if we could have the link to the document, the 6-page document, always included in our emails, that would be useful just to remind us. Check the rules ahead of the meeting, and then we can also have the email included in that document so that if we need to reach out to a specific individual and ask questions. I think it's just, think about your conflict of interest ahead of the meeting kind of reminder, I think would be useful for practice.
Okay. Good idea. Thank you. Let me just say that again, Kristen and staff worked really hard on this. There was a lot to do on this. The rules are actually quite complicated. There's lots of things going on. So I am extremely grateful to both Kristen and staff for spending so much time on this. They did a great job, sort of put me at ease as we worked through this, because this, it's an important change, and we needed to make sure that what we were going to do was, straight up and would likely pass the ethics board when they review it.
So, are you ready for a motion, Mr. Chair?
I believe I am. So we need a motion to approve to send the proposed commission policies to update the executive ethics boards for the board's review and approval. So we're essentially voting to take this update to send it to the board, the ethics board, for approval. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. So with that, I would like staff in this particular case to go ahead and do the roll call vote on this motion.
Thank you. This is a vote to approve to send the proposed commission policies update to the Executive Ethics Board for the board's review and approval. Dr. Grant Forsythe.
Yay.
Andy Knopfinger Meadows.
Yay.
Dr. Sharon Kyoko.
Yay.
Ron Viewing.
Yay.
And Jim Orr.
Yay.
We have a unanimous vote.
Great, thank you. So with that, we'll move on to the next item here, which is a reminder of the 2023 commission meeting schedule. And I'll turn this over to Eric Thomas, the legislative auditor.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You'll recall at the October meeting, we ran some preliminary dates for the 2023 meetings and subsequently made some adjustments. So these are the proposed dates for 2023. And of course, if there are conflicts, we still got some time that we can make adjustments at this point. But just very quickly want to remind you the purpose of each of the 4 meetings. Obviously, today you're going to be reviewing the 10-year review schedule and hearing the expedited reviews. In August is, I think, the most activity when you'll be hearing the full JLARC reviews of tax preferences. In September, you'll be hearing public testimony. And in October, based on the JLARC staff reports and public testimony, you will be drafting and adopting comments that will then be provided to the legislature. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
This is the chair. I would. There is a possibility I could have a conflict in September, October. It's very vague, so I don't want to change the dates. We're perpetually in a regulatory process with our rate cases, and so there are times where I'm towards September and October. Possibly I might be involved in something. It's completely uncertain at this point, but in that case, I would just reach out to the vice chair to potentially run the meeting that day. But I because it's so unclear, I don't want to change any dates. Okay, not seeing any questions, concerns. I think we'll, I guess, just stick with that schedule. Okay. So with that, we'll move on to a legislative session update. So Dana Lynn and Stephanie Hoffman and other JLARC staff will review a summary of legislative actions regarding tax preferences in the 2023 season.
Okay.
Oop.
Sorry, I'm just sharing a screen.
Okay. It's resisting.
It is existing. Okay. Sorry. Okay. I think we have it. The mouth does not like me all the time.
What happens when they have us
Don't
do
put
the
us in charge of
control?
technology. Good morning again, Chair Forsyth and Commissioners. I am Stephanie Hoffman, and my colleague Dana Lynn and I want to share some highlights from the 2023 session. It was a busy session with many bills related to tax preferences. For today, we want to talk about 3 bills that implemented legislative auditor recommendations from past reviews, 2 bills that relate to future reviews on our current schedule, and 14 bills that either create new preferences or expand or amend existing ones. So first, for the bills implementing recommendations, we have House Bill 1018, which implements the recommendation to continue the hog fuel sales and use tax exemption. And this was from our 2019 review. The bill extends the preference to June 2034 and adds a new performance statement related to providing 75% of the beneficiary employees with medical and dental insurance and retirement funding. Second is House Bill 1573. It implements recommendations from our 2022 review of dairy, fruit and vegetable, and seafood processors. The bill extends the preferences to July 2035 for all three industries. It does not implement the recommendation to allow to expire a preference for dairy products used as an ingredient or component in other dairy products. And this bill also adds a new performance statement focused on the number of businesses using the preferences and their total income, employment, and exemptions claimed. And finally, we have engrossed second substitute Senate Bill 5199. This implements the recommendation from our 2021 review of newspaper publishers to review the B&O preference and consider additional approaches to assisting the industry. The new bill grants a full exemption to printers and publishers of newspapers and eligible digital content, and it adds a new performance statement with metrics for JLARC to review. Then I'm going to cover the two bills that the legislature passed related to future reviews on our schedule. The first is Substitute House Bill 1318. This relates to the construction of airplane repair facilities. The bill extends the expiration date to 2031, and it changes some of the qualification requirements. Pete Van Morsel from our staff will provide some more detail on this one in a few minutes when we talk about our upcoming review schedule. And second substitute House Bill 1477 expands the working families tax credit to include those who are married filing separately. The bill amends the existing performance statement to require JLARC to provide written notice to certain entities if our future review finds that the exemption is not providing meaningful financial relief. Dana will cover the rest.
Thank you, Steph. Hi, all. Dana Lynn, staff to the commission. I'll talk a little bit about the 14 other bills we've identified that impact tax preference work. I'm just going to highlight the ones where there were fairly elaborate studies that are assigned to us. First of those is for Senate or Substitute House Bill 1163, which provides a new leasehold excise tax exemption for arenas that seat certain number of people. This specifically is for Climate Pledge Arena. The tax preference performance statement does require us to conduct a pretty far-reaching review that not only looks at the state and local fiscal impacts, but the number of employment positions and wages at the facility for all employers, not just the facility necessarily, the degree to which employment positions at the facility are filled by people from economically disadvantaged areas in the county, and also the race and ethnicity of those employees. And in addition, we have to look at the extent that the operational entity for that arena provides opportunities for patrons of all income levels to enjoy various programming at the facility, and also the extent that the operational entity generally contributes resources to organizations that serve that region and the surrounding facility, and programs and services for youth, arts, music, and culture. So a big study, most of these studies that I'm going to talk about will be in the early 2030s, we believe, just based on expiration dates and the 10-year review cycle that we have. The next one I'll highlight is a little farther down the list. It is a Senate bill that creates new property tax exemption for rentals of accessory dwelling units. If approved by the county legislative authority, the ADUs have to be used to rent to low-income households, and they have to meet a number of other requirements. And our review has to look not only at the costs and benefits of the exemption, but the number of applicants, the number of units that are being exempted, fees and costs to administer the program, evaluate the Department of Commerce's inventory and analysis of existing and projected housing needs, summarize statewide costs and benefits that are attributable to that exemption, and evaluate the program's impact on low-income households. The next preference that has that will likely be of interest to you, was of interest to me, was bringing back from the dead an expired tax preference. Brant and Ron, you may remember this, a B&O tax. This created a new B&O tax deduction for cooperative finance organizations. We had reviewed that back 2015 or 16, I believe, and it expired. It had an expiration date and was allowed to expire. This bill brought that tax preference back, and it does have a performance statement that requires us to evaluate it and determine whether it has been used by at least one Washington Cooperative Finance organization during the review period. And finally, I'll end up with another large incentive package bill that's in gross substitute Senate Bill 5447 that involves alternative jet fuel production. That particular bill created 3 new B&O tax preferences and a public utility tax preference to encourage alternative jet fuel production and wholesale and retail sales in the state. The preference starts right away, but it actually can't be used by anyone until the Department of Ecology notifies the Department of Revenue that there's a facility in the state with a cumulative production capability of at least 20 million gallons of alternative jet fuel. I have no idea if there's one even close here, but we'll find out, I guess. And again, an elaborate review for JLARC, including the production and use of jet fuels, additional pollution that results from production of these things, economic growth of this particular industry in the state, and finally, a racial equity analysis of air-related pollution in communities near SeaTac Airport. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have on those bills I spoke of or anything else that's listed in this new legislation. Oh, I did want to highlight one thing too. 9 of these bills that we've talked about this morning included specific exemptions from RCW 8232-808, which requires a tax performance statement. So in those cases, they don't generally have any kind of review language for us. A lot of times they don't include criteria to really help us evaluate much. So they'll go on our review schedule and they'll go in the database, and you'll determine later on whether or not we review those.
Questions from commissioners? I do have just one quick comment about the alternative jet fuel. You know, they are making a lot of progress on electric planes, in effect. So would that be considered alternative to jet fuel in the bill?
I don't believe so. Alternative jet fuel is defined in the bill, and it includes, it is not electric.
Okay. Interesting. Well, no shortage of work, let me put it this way. Okay. Any other comments? And actually, I can't see everybody's hand, so if staff sees a hand up, please let me know. Okay. Right. Thank you very much for that review. We'll turn now to the next item, which is actually going to be an action item, and that's to review schedule updates and to the review schedule from Pete Van Morsel, JLARC staff. He will give us an update of any changes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. Good morning. I'm Pete Van Morsel, staff to JLARC and to the Commission. And this next item before you is an action item, as you mentioned. I'll present the JLARC staff proposal for updates to the 2024 tax preference review schedule. And statute dictates that the Commission revise the tax preference review schedule each year, and that it consider or take into account new or expired tax preferences or amended tax preferences, as you'll hear about in just a moment. We prepared a memo for this agenda item that's shared on the screen, and this is organized into 3 parts. The first of these is a summary of the staff recommendation for the 2024 full review schedule. And this is the schedule that we propose that you adopt today. This comprises 26 tax preferences. And though that's more than we've reviewed, it's a larger count of preferences than we've reviewed in the more recent years. We do believe that to be a manageable workload because we anticipate grouping them into 4 tax preference reviews, which are listed on the memo here. The first of these is one that's undoubtedly familiar to many of you. It's a review of 9 tax preferences for the aerospace industry. And this is one that's been reviewed twice by JLARC in the last 10 years, most recently in 2019, because the legislature in its performance statement indicated that we were to review this every 5 years. It's coming up again. And so we anticipate providing more of a status update on the changes that have occurred in the tax preferences and their claims and the employment in the aerospace industry since 2019. The next grouping is 8 tax preferences related to the aluminum industry, which were last reviewed in 2015. 4 of these are scheduled to expire in 2027, which is why they are on the agenda for 2024. And since they were last extended in 2015 with the creation of a tax preference performance statement, there have been some significant changes in the aluminum industry in Washington, and that there are currently no entities claiming the majority of these preferences. The next grouping is a set of 8 tax preferences supporting alternative fuel transportation. These include the sales and use tax exemptions for alternative fuel vehicles, so B&O and PUT credits for commercial alternative fuel vehicles and infrastructure to fuel them, and zero emissions buses and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. 3 of these expire July 1st, 2025, which is why they are on the agenda. And I should note that these first 3 groupings are already currently on the 2024 full review schedule that you've previously adopted. The one change for the full review schedule to add is number 4, a customized workforce training business and occupation tax credit. This is a credit for a portion of the payments that businesses make to the State Board of Community Technical Colleges for customized training programs. This has a performance statement and is expiring July 1st, 2026, which is why we propose a full review in 2024. The second portion of the memo highlights the changes that would be necessary to make to arrive at the schedule I've just described. Again, first, this would require adding the customized workforce training credit to the full review schedule. It would involve moving 3 preferences off of the full review schedule to the alternates list. First among these is a billing discounts public utility tax credit. This is a credit available to light and power businesses for the discounts that they provide to low-income customers. And it's essentially a piggyback on the federal low-income heating energy assistance program. Next are 2 preferences, a business and occupation tax and sales and use tax exemption for sales of precious metals and bullion. This was previously reviewed in 2013, and there has been no legislative action on the recommendation to review and clarify these preferences since. And finally, as Stephanie mentioned in the previous agenda item, the current full review schedule includes a review of the airplane repair facility, new construction, sales and use tax exemption. There have been no beneficiaries of that tax preference thus far, and the 2023 legislature extended the preference by 4 years to give a few more years for beneficiaries to claim this one. Thus, we propose to move it to a later review year, namely 2028. And finally, the third portion of the memo describes the methodology by which we scoped out each of these preferences. This is unchanged from prior years, so I won't go over these in detail, but I'm happy to answer questions about them. And I wanted to point out that the last page of the memo describes the full and shows all the preferences on the proposed full review schedule that you'll be voting on today. So that concludes my comments, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission. I'd be happy to try and answer any questions for you.
Any questions from commissioners? Okay, not seeing any. With that, thank you, Pete, for that review. So with this, do we have a motion to approve the review schedule updates?
Also move.
Thank you.
Second.
Okay, thank you. So we have a second. So with that, I would like to ask staff to conduct a roll call vote for the approval of these changes.
Thank you. This is a vote to approve the schedule updates. Dr. Grant Forsythe,
Yay.
Andy Knopfinger Meadows,
Yay.
Dr. Sharon Kyoko,
Yay.
Ron Buing,
Yay.
Jim Orr,
Yay.
and we have a unanimous vote. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we're going to move on to our last action item for the day, and it's approval of the testimony questions for 2023. And I will turn it over to Eric Thomas of JLARC staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you said, this is an action item. These are the 4 questions that the committee is designed to help people testify in September kind of testimony. And this is an annual chance to review these questions and have the opportunity to amend or edit any of these questions if you so choose to do so.
Any comments or suggested changes from commissioners? Okay, not seeing any. Do I have a motion to approve the testimony questions for 2023?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, great, thank you. So again, ask JLARC staff to conduct a roll call vote of commissioners.
Thank you. This is a vote to approve the testimony questions for 2023. Dr. Grant Forsythe,
Yay.
Andy Knopfinger Meadows,
Yay.
Dr. Sharon Kyoko,
Yay.
Ron Buing,
Yay.
and Jim Orr.
Yay.
Thank you. We have a unanimous vote.
Great, thank you. So the last item is the 2023 expedited preference review schedule, and we'll turn that back over to Pete and Liz Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, commissioners. As you mentioned, this next and last agenda item, I believe, is the review of the 2023 expedited report. Each year at the May meeting of the Citizen Commission, JLARC staff presents a report of the expedited tax preference reviews. And this year's report comprises 62 tax preferences that are on the 2023 review schedule and for which JLARC staff did not perform a full review and therefore do not include a legislative auditor recommendation. Instead, the information on the expedited report comes from the Department of Revenue's 2020 tax exemption study, from any prior JLARC reviews, or from other information if available. And before 2022, this report was a PDF document that included one entry per tax preference, but now the report for the last 2 years has been an interactive table to make the information more accessible by allowing the user to search and sort the information on various criteria. And Liz is going to walk through some of the features of that report.
Thanks, Pete. You can view the details of the report by clicking the button there, the summary. The table has lists the preference name along with a link to the DOR review. It has a link to a prior JLARC review if there was one, the legislative action, RCW, savings, and whether or not the commission determined it was critical to the construction. Clicking the column headers can sort the table. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a search by preference name or RCW. You can filter by text type. Or you could view only preferences that were reviewed by JLARC. There's a clear filters button to return you to the default view. And there is a return to summary button in the top right corner. And with that, we're happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from commissioners? Okay. Oh, Commissioner Buing?
Yeah, no real question. I just wanted to just say this is really excellent what you put together here. Really, really impressed. What a great way to put together information that we can readily access. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Looks good. Anything else from commissioners? All right. Well, with that, move to the final act of the day, which is just making sure we don't have anybody registered for public comment. If we do, the chair, myself, will recognize them. Staff, do you know if we have anybody here?
Thank you, Chair Forsyth. We do not have any testifiers today.
Oh, great. Thank you. Okay, with that, the chair will remind the audience that anyone wishing to provide written comment on today's agenda topics can submit them to JLARC, and there is a slide coming up here with all the relevant information of both email and physical address. Should you wish to submit any any comments or issues to JLARC. So I appreciate staff posting that. So before I go, any other final comments from commissioners or staff that we maybe need to discuss or raise? Well then, thanks so much for everybody's help. Great meeting. There was a lot of work behind this meeting. And so with that, I will call this meeting adjourned. Thank you so much, everybody.